Hey guys, welcome back. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. If you guys come back to these videos often and you really enjoy this content, please let me know by hitting that subscribe button and hit that bell for bell notifications so you are aware when we are posting new content. Remember, the format of this video is we take 6 used firearms that have come into the store either through our website or through the front door, give you guys about a 5-minute review of each to give you guys an idea of some different things out there on the market. Remember, the point of this video is strictly to be entertaining and educational. We are not making this video to sell anything, to keep in accordance with YouTube's policies. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it now. Alright, this video is brought to you by our website, WeBuyGuns.com. If you are considering selling a firearm or firearms collection, please log on to our site, create an account, and from there you can submit your firearms for an offer request. Now with that offer, you will get a printable offer certificate, which you can take with you to competing gun stores in your area to try and leverage yourself a better deal. If you're unable to get a better deal, go ahead and sell them to us. We do provide you with a paper check or ACH direct deposit to make the process as easy for you as possible. So please remember, go check us out at WeBuyGuns.com. That is where we source most of the firearms you see in these videos. Remember, the format of this video is we start with most common and move through least common as the video progresses, starting us off with our first spot. This is a Czechoslovakian CZ Model 52 or VZ52 chambered in 7.62 by 25 Tokarev. This is a rower-locked short recoil system, and it is actually pretty interesting and innovative for pistol design technology at the time. Now, if we go back in time to 1938, Czechoslovakia is occupied by Nazi Germany, and they would remain that occupation through the duration of the Second World War until 1945, when Czechoslovakia would more or less be liberated from Nazi control. Now, during this time, Czechoslovakia would continue manufacturing their armaments, their pistols and rifles, but mainly for use in German military service. So they were still coming out with their Mausers and their .32 caliber handguns. Now, after 1945, Czechoslovakia would get back to wanting to produce its own military equipment again, and they would start by first designing a new modern pistol for the 1950s era, which would be the VZ50. Now, this was chambered in .32 automatic as well, and was very heavily influenced off of the Walther PP design. In fact, it is almost a direct copy. Now, that was okay. However, .32, especially as we're moving through the 50s and 60s, is starting to be viewed as somewhat anemic. Now, in a lot of the Eastern Bloc countries, these countries are taking heavy influence from Russian Soviet design. Now, in World War II, the Russians have been using the TT-33 pistol chambered in 7.62 by 25 Tokarev. In the 1950s, Russia was looking at going to a more modern service sidearm themselves, so they had also taken a lot of influence from the Walther PP when they designed the Makarov. However, in Czechoslovakia, they really like this idea of the much faster velocity, much higher caliber round with much more potency and lethality. So they would want to design a new pistol based around the 7.62 by 25 cartridge. Now, Czechoslovakia is one of those Eastern Bloc countries that was very much, they wanted to produce things on their own manufacturing standards. They wanted to come up with their own design. So they used a lot of common cartridges with Soviet Russia, but they would come up with their own sort of packages. So instead of just adopting the TT-33 like a lot of other countries did, they came up with their design here, which is the CZ52 or the VZ standing for Model 52. Now, this is a single stack detachable box magazine. It does fire in single action only, and you're going to notice it is a very large firearm, especially for a service sidearm. But it was very rugged and very reliable, of course, with that roller locking system. Kind of similar to like a scaled down MG42. There's actually little rollers in there, and it's just an interesting design. Now, this would stay in production and in service with the Czechoslovakian military until the 1980s, so it's actually had quite a distinguished military service when it would be replaced by the CZ82 chambered the 9x18 Makarov. So that's when they would sort of start going the way of, again, the traditions of the Makarov line from Soviet Russia, but of course keeping in faith with their own design. So CZ82, I've had several of those on this channel. This would then go out of production and use there. Now, these have shown up on the U.S. civilian market for quite some time, and as surplus, they make interesting firearms. The pricing on them today continues to go up like all other surplus firearms, and you're anywhere from about $400 to $600 or so in most cases is what these are bringing. But a very interesting pistol. Very happy to get this one in and share it with you guys. Okay, up next is a firearm that comes to us from a viewer in Kentucky, so thank you so much for sending this one to us. This is a Velocity LLC VMAC 45. This is a .45 caliber pistol based off of the original MAC 10 design. Now, MAC stands for Military Armament Corporation, which was the company that would market and distribute this design throughout about the 1960s and 1970s. Now, this firearm was designed by Gordon Ingram in 1964. Whether you want to classify it as a submachine gun or a machine pistol, people will debate that. What it originally had, it was an open bolt design, chambered in 9mm and 45 ACP, which is what the Model 10 is chambered in. It had a wire collapsing stock. Now, through the 1960s, of course, you have the war in Vietnam just starting to ramp up. Gordon Ingram was hoping to get an audience with military special operations and law enforcement, which he saw some mild success. He would actually get a contract with with the military, which did see some use with this in special forces in Vietnam as well as in Grenada. But for the most part, the MAC series of submachine gun and later semi-automatic conversions really found their place on the U.S. commercial market. Now, in 1978, there was a married couple. They were Wayne and Sylvia Daniel, and they started the Cobra Firearms Manufacturing Company. Now, they had acquired the parent company of Military Armament Corporation, which at the time was the one manufacturing this submachine gun, is the MAC-10. And they, with that, got the rights to manufacture this. Now, they would go to work coming up with a civilian version of this, moving it from an open bolt to a closed bolt, and it would see some great success. They did get approval from the ATF to manufacture this firearm. However, in 1982, the ATF reversed their decision, saying that the closed bolt MAC pistols from Cobra were too easily convertible to fully automatic. So they ordered that they cease production of these. Now, they would try to rebrand and restructure using a couple different corporate names, but ultimately any attempt of manufacturing and branding this firearm would cease in 1994 with the assault weapons ban, as this was actually banned by name, and it would stay to that effect until 2004. Now, after the conclusion of the assault weapons ban, we didn't really see any other Cobra manufactured MAC series pistols coming into the market. However, since then, there has been a lot of different manufacturers that have been putting these out, including which we have right here, the Velocity LLC. So these are being made today. Although Cobra still exists as a company, there's really no indication that they're manufacturing firearms. There are parts that are manufactured for pre-existing Cobra firearms that are being distributed right now, but Cobra firearms themselves, I'm not seeing any coming out on the market. You guys saw in the recent unboxing video, I had a Cobra M11 that has since sold since doing this video, but what you have here with the Velocity firearms, you have a detachable stick magazine, just like the original, double stack, single feed. Of course, firing from the closed bolt, being semi-automatic, but the controls on this are identical to what you would find on the original, save for the selector switch. Now, I had an original 9mm MAC-10 that I did a video with 2 or 3 years ago, so you can go check that out. On the market today, these guys are retailing at about the $500 range, new when you can find them, so, you know, $400 to $500 used or so. The Cobras, original semi-automatic Cobras, are, depending on condition and whatnot, might be in about between $500 and $700. And the fully automatics are the original Macs, are probably the cheapest machine guns you can get, and those are going anywhere from about $7,000 to $9,000, depending on condition and what they come with. So anyway, very interesting series of firearms, and happy to get that one in and share it with you guys. Okay, up next we have a very popular rifle and a favorite of mine. This is an Israeli IWI Tavor SAR semi-automatic 5.56 bullpup, which feeds from a standard AR-15 detachable magazine, 30 rounds. Now, the story with this would actually begin back to the late 1940s. In 1948, when Israel would be formed as its own independent state. Now, ever since the late 1940s, Israel has been in a constant state of warfare, which has always led for its necessity to adapt and create really, really good, fine military armament. And this is somewhat of a culmination of the past several decades of that. So back in the late 1940s, when Israel first gets its start, it's using a bunch of expired Commonwealth firearms such as Sten machine guns, Vickers machine guns, and actually a hodgepodge of captured and retired German military equipment from World War II, such as K98 Mausers and MG34s, which you can actually cut the irony with a knife, as a lot of prisoners from the Holocaust who had survived had resettled in Israel. If they were in the military or the IDF, they would have been using the implements, the very implements used against them in the prior period of the Second World War. So first, their at-home adopted successful military firearm is designed by Uziel Gall in 1950, and that is the Uzi submachine gun. While they're a very reliable and compact firearm, something to keep in mind when we're thinking about the philosophy of this, it used a telescoping bolt-over-barrel system. It wasn't a subcaliber cartridge, so good as a supplemental battle implement, it was not going to suit its standard military role that Uziel Gall wanted it to. So instead, they would look at the rifle that everybody else was using through the 1950s, and that was the FAL. Israel would adopt the FAL in 1955, and it served well, especially in the arid, sandy conditions, and it was in the more potent, larger 7.62 cartridge, which they definitely liked. Now that was good, but through about the 60s and 70s, a lot of countries are going to intermediate cartridges. Israel would see this firsthand when they would go up against the Kalashnikov rifle in the Yom Kippur War, and they would realize very quickly the shortcomings of a full-size, large, heavy battle rifle. And even though the FAL was a good and reliable design, the AK, especially with its wider tolerances, just did better in the sandy conditions. So through the 1960s, they would take the AK and want to come up with their own sort of at-home, again, pattern using the benefits of the AK, but in the 5.56 cartridge, which its allies, like the United States, were moving into at that time. So through the 1960s, there would be a set of trials of which there would be multiple submissions. One from Yisrael Galil, I hope I am pronouncing his name correctly, and the M16 from the United States. So both would be adopted, the Galil as the primary issue rifle, but due to its higher cost of manufacture, the M16s actually saw much more use in the IDF. Now both of those would serve hand in hand through the 90s up until the early 2000s, when the United States is thinking about moving the M16 out of primary issue and going to an M4 carbine, which is more suitable for urban combat, or so the type of battle engagements the United States has seen itself get involved in. Israel also is looking at the very same concept. We want to move into a close quarters combat type of smaller scale firearm. They will also look at the M4A1 that the United States is producing, again because they already like the M16. However, arms designer Zalman Shebs had been working on this package and submitted it to the IDF, and they would compare this with the M4A1 and land on this. It was still about 6 inches shorter than the M4A1 because of its bullpup design, where the chamber is back here, so the barrel spends most of its life inside, the length of it is inside the receiver of the firearm. And they very much like this design. Now this has stayed with the IDF since 2001. In 2009 it would be updated into an even smaller package known as the X95. Now in the US consumer market, both of those rifles have been available. The IWI Tavor SAR, which is how it was adopted in this configuration, would come onto the US consumer market in 2013 as the SAR, this rifle here. And then in 2016 the X95 version would come to the US market. It was a little bit longer than the Israeli adopted version due to the length requirements we have here in the United States. Both are excellent rifles, but I do prefer the SAR over the X95, just personal opinion. Now, if we look at the pricing, they are still sold today in the $1,700–$1,800 range new. In fact, I don't even know if the SAR still is being made. I know the X95 is. And used, you're going to find them between about $12 and $15 or so, depending on their condition and what they come with. So, excellent rifles. Very happy to get this one in and share it with you guys. Okay, up next I have a couple classic pistols from the 1980s that I'm sure you guys recognize. We just had these in an unboxing video, but they're so interesting I wanted to be able to do a deeper dive, so here they are on the weekly used gun review as well. Both of these come to us from a viewer in Kentucky, so thank you so much for selling these to us. This is an Interdynamics KG99, later the Intratec Tech 9, and I'll talk about that. This is an AP9 made by AA Arms. Now, the story with this would actually begin in the 1980s, and the story here is a little intertwined, which is why they're both here. But in the early 1980s, there's a company known as Interdynamics AB in Sweden. They're interested in coming up with a new, very inexpensive submachine gun concept. Right now, the MP5 is really the dominant player in this space, but it's kind of expensive from HK, so what can we make that's good, reliable, and inexpensive to take to other countries for government and police contract that's affordable, especially which might appeal to sort of the lower cost minded countries that are out there. So they come up with a submachine gun known as the MP9. The MP9 looks just like this. It is an open bolt submachine gun, direct blowback, 9mm, feeding from a detachable box magazine, has a vertical grip and a collapsing stock. Now, it was effective insofar as it was semi-reliable and it was super inexpensive, but they could not find an audience with anybody who wanted to adopt it as a military or police submachine gun. So very quickly they would shift focuses to the commercial market, specifically in the United States. Now in the mid-80s, they would form a subsidiary company in Florida known as Interdynamic USA, and this would be headed up by Kelgrim and Garcia, the two that were in charge of sort of running and distributing this operation. Now, KG is their initials. KG9 would be the semi-automatic version that they would come to the United States with. The KG9 was just like the MP9, except for it did not have the vertical grip, it did not have the stock on it, and it was not full auto. It was semi-automatic only. However, it was still an open bolt. So the bolt would lock open on a sear like this, and then when you pull the trigger, the bolt would drop and it would fire, and then come back and lock open on a sear. At first in practice, this was fine. However, the ATF had issues with this because it was way too easy to convert this into a full auto. All you had to do was just grind down a couple of the internal parts and voila, your semi-automatic open bolt pistol would turn into a fully automatic open bolt submachine gun, and this was demonstratable. So the ATF ordered them to change and redesign this, and it had to be in a closed bolt configuration, which they would do with this model, the KG99. It is just like the KG9, except now we're on a closed bolt principle. However, since it was designed as an open bolt and the receiver was designed as an open bolt, a lot of the stresses of the bolt and the spring system were placed on the lower receiver, which is polymer. So when you would use higher pressure ammunition in the KG99, sometimes the frames would crack, which was the biggest complaint about this. So you had to stay with lower pressure 115 grain ammunition. Well, at some point, Kelgrim would leave Interdynamics, and it would be reformed by Garcia as Intratec, and he would then rebrand this pistol as the Tech 9, making some changes, including the way the rear of the receiver would be manufactured to eliminate the frame cracking issues. Also, if you recognize the name Kelgrim, that is the same gentleman who would move on to form Keltec. So, moving on, we have the Tech 9. The problem with the Tech 9 now is, through the late 1980s, it is getting a very bad reputation of being used not only in film but in real-world situations and, a game-related scenario. So in 1989 in California, they would order that this stop being manufactured. They would rebrand it again mainly by moving the sling swivel attachment points to a single point attachment in the rear, and they would rebrand it the Tech 9 DC, or the Tech DC9. Then in 1994, it would be completely banned again in the 1994 assault weapons ban, so this would be rebranded again as the AB-10 after ban 10 for 10-round capacity magazine. And then, as time would go on, these would just cease being manufactured and no longer are manufactured today, so they were built in many different variations. Now, as this is one of the earlier ones in its original form, other than not in the open bolt configuration, the KG9 is actually pretty valuable, and they're climbing up there in price. You get these on the market today, they're climbing up in excess of $800. So, again, very valuable. The Tech 9s are getting up there as well. So I've seen these things climb upwards of $1,000 plus, surprisingly. And again, they're not good quality. They are known as Jam-O-Matics, but it's the nostalgia and the collectability. It's the only reason people are spending that much money on these. Now we come over to the AP9. Looking at the success of the Tech 9, and it was very successful mainly because of its price point. They only sold for around $250. They came up with something that was going to be AA Arms and distributed by Kimmel. They wanted to come up with something that could sort of, ride the wave of this. It's like manufacturers coming out with the AR-15, which is the popular rifle. Many different people make them. They wanted to come up with their own version of this type of package, and they did. In fact, the magazines are even interchangeable. These are Tech 9 Max. This, likewise, was also known as not being very high quality and also a Jam-O-Matic, but was inexpensive. Now, this would go into production in the late 1980s, again, riding the success of the Tech 9, so in 1988 they would come out with these, and they would cease production in 1994 due to the assault weapons ban. The pricing on these is also climbing up there, and not very many people know about the AP9, which is why I just wanted to throw it in here since I had it. Typically, you're looking at about $600 to $800 depending on condition and what it comes with. So anyway, very interesting pistols. Happy to get those in and share them with you. Okay, up next is a very interesting rifle that comes to us from a customer in Oregon. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a South Korean Daewoo K2 rifle, which is a semi-automatic version of the variant that was adopted by the South Korean military in the 1980s. Now, we could really go back to post-Korean War. The United States is supplying South Korea with old dated World War II American firearm technology. These are M1 Garands, M1 and M2 carbines, 1919 belt-fed machine guns, BARs, M3 grease guns. You guys get the point. Now, this is fine, but as we're going through the 60s and 70s, South Korea starts realizing they need their more at-home domestic manufacturing, and they need something in the more modern era. You have things like the M16s and the AKMs and the FALs and G3s and ZMCs all being developed around the world. M1 Garands and M1 carbines aren't going to cut it anymore, especially with a very large and growing hostile enemy just over their border. So they would start with an arms program, and this would be in the 1970s, and this would start in 1972 with a series of experimental rifles known as the XB1, XB2, XB3, XB4, and XB5. Now, in this program, they had a couple stipulations, a couple things that they wanted to have. Number one, and most interestingly enough, they wanted the rifle to be chambered in 7.62 NATO. Remember, this cartridge is being adopted by a lot of other countries, so South Korea figured it would follow suit. One other thing is they had looked at the technology of the M16 in the United States. They wanted to follow closely to that pattern, including a direct gas impingement system. So from 1972 to 1974, they are experimenting with these rifles, yet they are not near acceptance and completion. So in 1974, they would try to fill the gap by getting into a contract with Colt on the M16 pattern, which they would secure and start producing and manufacturing. However, the licensing agreement was way too expensive, and they cannot manufacture nearly enough with the amount of money that it was costing for licensing to satisfy their military needs. They had in excess of 1 million troops just in reserve. So again, they had a huge demand for something that was scalable and could be made back at home. Now, in 1975, just 1 year after their contract, they would get back to the drawing board, but they would make a couple revisions. This would start with the XB6. They would move from, instead, the direct gas impingement, they would move to a long stroke gas piston like found in the AK. And then the XB7, which took that exact same package, but scaled it down to the 5.56 instead of the 7.62. And now they are onto something. And by 1982, they come out with a final variation called the XB7C, which was then shortened down to Experimental K2 or XK2, which they would then put out for trials in the field. Now, by 1983, 1984, these are starting to see wide-scale success. On top of that, because they had been receiving firearms from their ally, the United States, they did not have much of an arms manufacturing industry in Korea, so they would turn to the biggest conglomerate they had, which was Daewoo, who is known today as an appliance manufacturer, and Daewoo would actually be the ones making these rifles. By 1985, they had proof of concept. They had a rifle that was good, it worked, it was in the 5.56, used M16 magazines, a long stroke gas piston like an AK, very reliable. They had proof of concept on manufacturing from Daewoo, so they would adopt this officially in 1985 as the K2, just dropping the X from experimental. So now you have the K2 rifle in 1985. Now, around this time, this is when a lot of foreign military exports are coming into the United States. This would be one of those to come in as well. There would be many different importers. Stoeger, I think, was the first. This one imported by IACO SAC in California. And these would start coming in many different names based on what the importers called them. This was actually imported as the AR-100. They were imported also as the K2, as the Max 2, and I believe that's it. The military version, actually, which is still used in South Korea today, has seen very little revision, other than in 2013 they put a bunch of rails and stuff on it so they could put lights and optics. But other than that, is the exact same rifle. Now, in 1989, this would fall victim to, of course, the importation restrictions from then President Bush Sr. So then they brought in the DR-200, which had the thumbhole stock and no bayonet lug. And those came in for a few years as well. And the DR-300 was the same rifle, but in 7.62 by 39. Those only came in through about the 90s, I believe 1990. They were brought in, I think, through the assault weapons ban, if I remember correctly, through about 1997, but then that was it. So they came into the country for about 10 years, and because of that, they are collector's pieces today. Very interesting rifles, I've always had an interest in these. I think they're really cool. It's a side folder because the recoil system is here. Side folding stock, just a really, really unique rifle. On the market today, these wide in a wide range of pricing, but usually $2,000 on the low end, you know, upwards of the mid-range, you know, like $25 to $3,000 on the high end. And that's, of course, going to be based on condition and what it comes with. So excellent condition with original box is, of course, going to be on the higher end of that. No box and, you know, this is good condition is going to be on the lower end of that scale. But anyway, very interesting rifles. Very happy to get that in and share it with you. Last but not least is a very collectible firearm. This is a German, what is known as the Artillery Luger, chambered in 9mm Luger. Now this one comes to us from a local customer, so thank you so much for selling this one to us. Now the story with this would actually begin with Georg Luger. He had gotten a job with Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken, DWM, in the 1800s, the late 1800s, and working for DWM also at the time was Hugo Borchardt. Now Borchardt had come out with the C93 pistol, which was very odd in many different facets. It was very long, heavy, it had this cumbersome snail-looking apparatus kind of towards the back of the pistol. It was very complicated and difficult to manufacture, but it was sort of early proof of concept of a semi-automatic pistol design. Now remember, most militaries around the world are still using revolvers, so the Hugo Borchardt, design of the C93 was very revolutionary. Now as mentioned, Georg Luger was also working at DWM, had seen the success or at least the promise of the C93 and realized that he could sort of incorporate on its design a little, scale it down, make it a little less complicated, if you want to call a Luger less complicated, and have something that was going to be more easily adaptable and more appealing to a military application or purchased by different countries for their military use. Now Switzerland would be interested in the Luger and purchase those as well as later the German military themselves would be interested with the P04 design and the Navy Luger, and later the Heer with the P08. Now one interesting development off of the P08 design was this very long barreled 8-inch artillery Luger. Now this would be fitted with a rear tangent sight here, getting away from the V-notch here in the rear. They would be issued with this snail drum type magazine as well as a wooden stock, and this would be issued to artillery personnel. I guess this would give artillery personnel something that was easy to carry, very compact, and very lightweight, but something that they could deploy with high capacity here and a shoulder stock, giving a pretty handy little carbine that could be broken down and worn on a belt. Similar sort of concept with the C96 broom handle Mauser, later developed by Mauser, or later after the C93 I should say. Very, very cool. Now these would be manufactured by DWM as mentioned, as well as Erfurt, only in the First World War. This concept had really kind of been deleted by the Second World War and in the interwar period. This particular one manufactured by DWM in 1917, which is the most common year of manufacture on these. Now, this particular one is in excellent condition and is all matching except for the grips, including its original magazine. The snail drum was not original to the firearm. The previous owner purchased this separately. Very interesting pistols, and of course Luger collectors really like the idea of having an artillery Luger somewhere in their collection just because of their odd and unique shape and design. Now on the market today, like any other variant of the Luger, is all over the place. You find them in the lower end of condition, around $1,400 or $1,500. You get them in complete rigs, all matching stocks and everything, matching grips. Museum quality grade, they get upwards of $5,000, $6,000 with all original and matching parts with original snail drums. So very interesting piece. These snail drums alone are quite valuable, ranging anywhere from about $700 to $1,200 depending on variation and condition. So yeah, that's really it with that, but always good to end up a video with a classic piece such as an artillery Luger. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you are aware when we are posting new content. I'm going to leave you guys off with that. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.